All right. I guess we should start now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Countermapping for Urban Social Justice, Dispossession, Resistance, and Spaces of Hope, which is a seminar brought to you by SHLC and the Glasgow Centre for International Development. We're delighted you have joined us. My name is Andre Ortega, and I'm a research fellow here at the Center for Sustainable, Healthy, and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods here at the University of Glasgow. I'm also very pleased to welcome our colleagues from the University of the Philippines. We have Dr. Yanni Lopez and Maria Simeona Martinez. Both are faculty members from the Geography Department of the University of the Philippines. So this seminar is supported by funding from the Global Challenges Research Fund via the Scottish Funding Council. So our seminar starts with a presentation, which will begin shortly. This will be followed by an audiovisual exhibition here at the university. Fortunately, we will not be able to live stream this section of the seminar, but for those joining online, please use the chat room in Zoom to ask us any questions. So if you would like a copy of the video recording and presentation slides and have not yet registered via Eventbrite, please write your email on the registration sheet or in the chat room, and we will add you to the attendee list. All right, so we shall start our presentation. So I will present a brief overview of countermapping, and then my colleagues from the Philippines will talk about various aspects of countermapping in relation to what we have done in the Philippines. So let me start by quoting this very famous quote by John Harley that states that maps are never value-free images. This is critical to our work in thinking about how maps and cartography involve particular interests in agenda. So as geographers from the Philippines, this point is relevant as we reflect upon how maps are political projects associated with historical legacies of colonialism, contemporary statecraft, and development aggression. For the state and the market, cartography, and the church in the case of the Philippines, cartography has served as an important mode of control and facilitation of consent, as it produces maps for multiple projects, from maps used in textbook for school children or to land use maps in master plans for cities. So given these points, we consider countermapping as a necessary response. It suggests a particular vantage point to what Dorothy Hodgson and Richard Schroeder would point out as mapping against dominant power structures to further seemingly progressive goals. As such, for us, countermapping not only questions assumptions or biases of cartographic conventions, but it has to upset power relations for the benefit of marginalized groups, the oppressed. So in short, we consider countermapping as sort of reclaiming mapping for and with the people. So for our countermapping practice, we conceptualize this in two ways. With one, it enables resistance as it attempts to gather together information from various peoples to consolidate narratives of oppression. And two, it attempts to move towards emancipatory engagements with the hope of producing a more grounded and community-oriented sustainable futures. So first, in thinking about countermapping as a form of resistance, in an effort to co-produce maps with marginalized communities, resistance against specific social injustices is forged through processes of consolidation of narratives, traditions, beliefs, and other aspects of everyday life. Countermapping tends to uncover and foreground these narratives that dominant institutions attempt to silence and hide through their maps. So for us, in our practice of countermapping, we are sensitive also to the various steps in the production of and dissemination of our maps. We ask, what is the main issue of a specific project that we're looking at? And how are we going to collect data with the community? What kinds of maps are relevant to community and stakeholders? And how do we communicate various outputs? For one, a critical point or part of our counter mapping project is to ask what form of maps are we going to produce and how are we going to communicate them, and who is our target audience. In the Philippines, many groups and organizations have been engaged in participatory mapping projects over the past recent decades. And these projects have spanned various issues from disaster risk management to indigenous land rights. For us Filipino geographers, many of our projects on counter mapping have focused on development aggression that has affected marginalized groups from urban poor to peasants. So what I'll do in the next few minutes for these slides is to present key themes and lessons we have learned thus far in our various counter mapping projects. And in the process of presenting all these projects, I'm going to present some of the key insights and some of the lessons and useful ways in which counter mapping has enabled us to do. One of the ways is exposition. Exposition in this manner involves the exposition of particular issues. One example is a project involving a suburban development south of Manila. Our counter mapping project that involved this particular issue has served as a way of exposing development aggression affecting farming communities that are experiencing harassment by the military. Facing threats of demolition, this county mapping project exposed sites of encroachment by a landed elite family and the displacement of farmers with the construction of this suburban development. Through the project, students and the community were able to show the extent of land grabbing in the area. Another key lesson for us for our counter mapping projects involves the grounding of contradiction. As Mark Mamonnier claims, maps can lie, and counter mapping can belie maps that aim to silence and hide certain grounded truths. So to feature this particular point, we would like to give an example of a development project north of the Philippines, which proposes an idealized space that is green and investment friendly, as you can see in this slide. Its land use maps tend to project spaces that seem to be ready for development, devoid of the various tensions involving the various communities in the area. Through this particular project, we accounted for the multiple everyday spaces erased by these land use maps, from sacred spaces to fishing grounds, recreational sites, recreational spaces, to burial grounds. Given that maps of these development plans were not communicated to the indigenous communities to be affected by the project, our counter mapping project in this case served to expose the contradictions and absurdity of these development plans. This slide, for example, as you can see, shows the proposed projects to be put up in this area. And these projects involve a Navy post, a pier, a supposed wedding venue, and even hotels. But upon closer inspection, many of the sites are impenetrable and are in fact not conducive for these projects. So through counter mapping, we're also able to consolidate multiple spatial narratives and overlay them with maps of development plans. It facilitates these so-called productive tensions between state-rendered spaces and the grounded realities of marginalized groups. It gathers together grounded narratives with the hope of consolidating a more cohesive community response against development aggression. And this is one of the examples of our outputs involving this previous project, wherein we are able to identify some of these contradictions from which We overlaid the everyday spaces of the communities and the land use maps that were not communicated to them. Now, this brings me to a key task for our countermapping projects, which have been to engage the public. We always ask what kinds of maps and visual representations do we use and how do we communicate them? We have attempted to create, and in the process of conducting all these countermapping projects, one of the key goals is to create spaces that connect the university, communities, and the various institutions that might be helpful in advocating for the concerns of the communities where we've partnered with. So, and as an example of the projects that we have done in the past, one effort involves one of our collaborators here, Oni Martinez's class, which used data from a countermapping project that I did with several students in the past, wherein she used data for her class and for a blog site created by students, and they also conducted several exhibits in the university. Another example that we tried to engage not just the public, but also the various communities that are affected by development aggression is this mixed art countermapping project that partnered with an urban poor community fighting demolitions in Manila, wherein me and a colleague of mine who's in theater arts, who is also now in geography, are conducted this sort of mixed performance arts project that connected the community and the university. So in the process of thinking about how to engage the multiple publics and the various stakeholders, we try to reflect upon on how to engage these various sectors and what kinds of outputs do we want to have. Are we going to produce online maps, memes, poster maps, or are there possible maps that can be used for legal claims, or some map arts that can be useful for their campaigns? But for this project, we feature the impacts of this big development project by the Philippine government called the New Clark City. It aims to create a supposedly world-class, modern, disaster resilient, and smart city of the future of the Philippines. It has released numerous promotional materials, and you will see some of them in this exhibit. These materials supposedly reflect these visions and visions of an ideal city that has some flavor of the Philippines. So the project will cover 9,450 hectares of land and promises to provide 800,000 jobs. Another sort of hook that it tries to, or another way in which it's promoting, or the project's being promoted, is that the government is claiming that it will decongest Manila because it's roughly like 100 kilometers north of Manila. It aims to decongest Manila by transferring government offices into the area and provide housing for new residents. However, the new city will also be built on prime agricultural land inhabited by thousands of farmers and indigenous communities. So for me and my colleagues here, such represents a contradiction where new houses and new residences for the population, for the future, for Filipinos, for Filipinos of the future Philippines, will be built upon the displacement and the eviction and the destruction of homes of another population, also of Filipinos. Thus, we put together this counter-mapping project. So that's why we're here. So the goals of the project is to account for the experiences of farmers and indigenous groups in the area, in the province of Tarlac, and to develop a counter-mapping methodology that can be used in various contexts. Most of our past projects were actually unfunded. A lot of them were labor of love, amidst the load of a lot of, when I was back then in the University of the Philippines. So because of this project, this enabled us to reconsolidate, to come back together and develop a more sort of rigorous methodology and bring together more people and various stakeholders. So for this project, we aim to account and map for everyday lives of the communities to be affected and co-produce maps relevant to their causes. We envision this project also as a way to support these communities and help bring together key stakeholders in fighting development aggression, which is not just happening in this part of the Philippines. In fact, in that region north of Manila, there are other development aggression issues that are happening. And for this particular project, we look at three sectors, three types of population. We have farmers, the youth, and the Aitas, who are the main indigenous groups of the area. So that's sort of the overview of our project. And now I will turn you to Yanni Lopez, who will discuss the specific counter mapping process that we did for this project.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Andre. So I'm here to present the different data collection methods that we have implemented in the study area. So the activity that took place between December of 2018 until April of 2019. So a reconnaissance activity was conducted last December 15 to 16 of 2018. So the main objectives of the reconnaissance activity include observe the situation of the area, second, establish contacts in the community, and third, conduct initial conversations with the community and set the project objectives with them. So after the reconnaissance activity, data consolidation was conducted. We have collected comprehensive land use plans and other government documents related to New Clark City, maps, magazines, and news articles on New Clark City, videos and documentation materials related also to New Clark City. So after consolidation of secondary documents, there were a series of workshops and dialogues with team members to plan on how to go about the field activities and the different ways on how to gather field data. So we had identified the study sites and participants and finalized the details of the project implementation. Timeline of the study was also set, and all of these details were then communicated with the community organizer of the area. So these were the identified study sites. We have 3 sitios. So a sitio is a small subsection area of a barangay, which is the smallest administrative unit in the Philippines. So we have the plain area of Sitio Kamatis, number 1, the mountainous orchard of Sitio Ali, and we have the upland area of Sitio Kalangitan, mostly inhabited by an indigenous population mentioned earlier by Andre Aita. And as mentioned earlier by Andre, 3 sections or 3 sectors of the population were identified as participants for the study. We have the lowland and upland farmers, the indigenous population, and the youth. For the timeline of the study, December 2018 was allocated for the planning and preparation for field activities, and January up until April of 2019 were set for the collection and at the same time doing the processing of the data. The presentation of initial results to the community was also conducted April of 2019 for verification and validation. And finally, the months of May to June was set for the dissemination of results. Okay, so at the very start of the field activity for each of the 3 sitios, the team conducted an orientation. So orientation were utilized to discuss the study objectives, with the community, respond to questions and clarifications from the community, and negotiate the expectations of both the community members and the research team. So another objective of the orientation was to obtain consent and permission from the community to conduct the research activity. So after gaining the consent, the team proceeded with the first data collection activity. Participants were each asked to draw the layout of their community and to indicate the places where they conduct their daily activities, identify issues and challenges they encounter as a household and as a member of the community. And they were also asked to provide solutions that they believe can address these identified issues. Data gathered would reveal the characteristics of their everyday spaces, challenges, as well as aspirations and imagined futures. So community mapping using satellite images followed after the individual mental mapping, and the collective knowledge of the community was elicited as they identified important points of interest such as schools, farmlands, source of water supply for the community, areas affected by the road construction and infrastructure development. So after the conduct of the individual and community mapping, the team proceeded with windshield survey. So this was done in two ways. So the team drove around the community, and the other one, the team walked along with the participants. So photos and GPS tracks and waypoints were recorded during the survey. Another activity, we had drone mapping. So drones are unmanned aerial vehicles that can take photos or videos of places from a certain height. So drone mapping was conducted on areas where there are glaring impacts of development aggression, one of which was this shot taken by the drone. So it used to be a mountain, now it was cut into half, where some of the debris that had fallen down on Sitio Kalangitan down below. So Sitio Kalangitan was identified as one of the study sites for this project. So next we have the focus group discussion. So FGDs were conducted with the three identified sectoral groups, the farmers, indigenous population, and the youth. So everyday activities as well as challenges, community relations, and their insights on the infrastructural development were documented. So photos and videos were also shown. So we have photo and video elicitation to participants to draw out their views and meanings they attach to the images that were shown to them. So aside from FGDs, we also had interviews. So a sit-down interview and a walking interview. So sit-down interviews were conducted with key informants such as community leaders and community organizer. Walking interview, on the other hand, is conducted together with geotagging and auto photography. So that would be the next data collection activity. So participants were asked to take photos of sites or places that are significant to their lives. After each site visit, data are collected, consolidated, and processed with the help of student volunteers. So if they're tuned in right now, shout out to them and to the team. So one way of processing data is to visualize the collected narratives or stories through interactive web maps. So similar to the poster map that is displayed today, so you can see that later in the exhibit. So significant sites marked or identified by the participants in their mental and community maps, geotag, waypoints in the walking interview, and photos taken were put together to come up with poster and web-based maps. So after the initial results of the study were generated, participants were asked to comment, verify, and validate the information generated from the FGD's interview and mapping activities. Right after the initial presentation of results, volunteers in the team shared and discussed reflections of their involvement and participation in the project. So you can see that some of the reflections, it will be also posted here. You can see that after the exhibit. So right after the initial presentation of results, volunteers in the, before wrapping up the project, the Dissemination of outputs and key findings are being conducted, one of which is this presentation we are doing right now in the exhibit. So there would also be a traveling exhibit within the surrounding municipalities of the affected areas in Tarlac, in Pampanga, so nearby the New Clark City, and schools and universities and art galleries. So in the University of the Philippines, we plan to have a week-long event where there would also be a forum, an exhibit, and also a cultural night. Social media is also another platform for information dissemination, as well as presentation and conference and writing of manuscripts. But all of these things, we had also ethical considerations in the implementation of this counter mapping process. So in the conduct of the study, number one consideration would be the privacy and anonymity of the participants. So the team ensured that identity of the participants are secured, although there was a conversation among team members with regards to the utilization of videos where faces of participants are shown. So permission must obtain with regards to the showing of videos. Second would be the use of drone. So there was a constant dialogue among the team members about the utilization and the limitation of drone as a research method. So there was an agreement that land heavily impacted areas by the infrastructure development that the drone will be documenting and relatively far from the settlement area. So that's the agreement of the team. So third would be expectations from researchers. Community members were expecting that through the research activity, they would be able to secure their land titles. So this was there was a constant reminder, especially from the community organizer, that one of the objectives of the research project, and that is to articulate and showcase their everyday life and challenges in the form of maps and other creative outputs. And these outputs would help raise awareness to fellow community members and people outside of their community. So there was this high expectations from the researchers to obtain or to help them obtain their land titles. Number four, participants' varied and conflicting interests. So field immersion activities revealed the ongoing tensions among community members. Indigenous population in relations with the lowland and upland farmers. So for the indigenous people, they felt that their lands, particularly the ancestral lands, were being taken over or taken away from them by the farmers. And some farmers felt betrayed because other farmers already sold their lands to BCDA and did not hold on and put up a fight. Okay, so that's some of the reflections or the ethical considerations that we have encountered in this particular project. And I turn over the presentation to Oni Martinez now for the other lessons learned from the counter mapping activity.
Thank you, Dr. Yani Lopez. And so now I'd like to discuss or sort of also present the lessons that we have learned along the process of engaging in counter mapping. And also the one important aspect of this part of the presentation of the group is to present some reflection points for all of us to think about, especially for people who would like to continue engaging in progressive activist research, and especially coming from a country and a community where there's just, layers of conflicts and concerns in different players and different stakeholders. So with this, we'd like to state that we would like to espouse research that is reflective and geared towards resistance. Dr. Andre Ortega's explained prior to my presentation that counter mapping is a tool that offers and explores alternatives and possibilities, and that we'd like to put counter mapping in the context of activist research, and that we'd also like to emphasize that counter mapping is more than making maps. For my part of the presentation, I'd also be showing you some of the findings, outputs, and outcomes. And so, reiterating the points that have been raised by Dr. Andre Ortega earlier, we'd like to say that counter mapping as a tool, or as an approach, or as a method for activist research is a way of framing our research, our work, and creating representations that engage communities, collaborate explicitly in creative and productive ways with the oppressed and the marginalized. We also emphasize that mapping, as we do it in the context and practice of counter mapping, is embedded in social movement, and that has been the history of counter mapping, and that research is rooted in critical thought and should be informed by grassroots experience. Me also speaking based on quite an extensive background and experience working with communities, different communities in the Philippines, and using maps as tools for representation and sending out messages about lived experiences, struggles that different communities face in different contexts. With our project, we've also come to realize that counter mapping is really more than making maps. If we're expecting that the maps are the primary output, yes, of course, they're part of the output, but we've also learned in the process that this is also about weaving stories that come from the experience of the grassroots, from the experience of communities that have been subjected to various forms of marginalization and oppression, and that it's very important to be able to share it in creative ways to people outside of that situation, so that they'd be able to understand and perhaps also change their worldview and look into the lives of the people who are continuously experiencing these kinds of or forms of oppression. We'd also like to emphasize that counter mapping draws its strength from the commitment towards change and transformation, because an important element of engaging with the community is believing that the situation can be improved for the better, and that the structures that persist or support this process of marginalization can be overturned or responded to. So we'd also like to highlight that in the process of engaging with counter mapping, there are values and guiding principles, or principles that we'd like to espouse. And this would include one, inclusivity or inclusiveness, which translates to acknowledging that within a community of oppressed, identities and interests and motivations vary. So as mentioned in our research, we dealt with farmers, indigenous peoples, youth, women, and these sectors of our society, of the community, would have different motivations and would have different experiences as well. And that part of the idea of being inclusive is the respect for the diversity of perspectives and motivations, and that this should also be means by which we could foster the diversity of authorship of maps, because this is a co-production, a process of co-producing knowledge, a process of co-producing messages, and it has to be co-authored and co-owned. And also to be open to the idea that there should not also be a privileging of just one source of data by saying that state maps, for example, are the only ones that are authoritative, and also there's no one method of mapping, because there are multiple ways of mapping and expressing spatial knowledge. We also espouse transparency, which would pertain to clarity of goals and methodology, and explaining that to the people that we work with and to the people who are taking part of our research, and that the products or our outputs are co-created with the community And as such, data such as maps and other information that are being produced by sources like the state or government agencies pertaining to development projects or infrastructural projects that would affect different communities should also be made accessible and intelligible and comprehensible to the public and also to the non-experts. So we also try in this process of counter mapping to convert, technical maps to maps that could be easily understood by the people and easily interpreted by them and useful to them. Dr. Yanni Lopez has also mentioned about ethical practices. So we make sure that the process of conducting research and counter mapping is consultative. So we consult the community and the research participants on the activities that we will conduct and how research outputs will be disseminated, because it's very important to let them know as we co-plan with them, how would the outputs be communicated with people outside of the community, and what kinds of, or what do we expect to be the impacts of these outputs. And we also want to be transparent about our intentions and our engagements in the work that we do, even outside of that project. Cultural sensitivity is also part of our guiding principles, which it would include respect to local practices, asking them what's feasible, what's permissible, and not. And I also like to quote from part of the reflection of our colleagues from the project who unfortunately we were not able to accompany us today, that doing research, we cannot and should not impose our own values and time constraints to our research partners. And as soon as we step into the communities, we have to be able to adapt and also understand the context and the practices that is there in the community. So I'm taking this from Ms. Noreen Sapalo's reflections on the methods that we have conducted. Lastly is about empowerment and transformation. So that we espouse community empowerment through raising the awareness of people within and outside of the community. And we do this by provision of information about the project, the plans of the government about New York City, the production of informative materials, and we also are helping in this process of counter mapping the community to articulate their experiences and their needs. And we also hope to create more venues for conversations such as this and the future exhibits that we will be engaging in, and the production of pedagogical materials that we hope to disseminate to local universities, to local schools, especially in the areas proximate or within that New Clark City that we have been talking about, to promote co-learning and co-knowledge production outside of the immediate context of the research that we have been conducted. I sincerely apologize for this. We worked for several hours on the presentation, but unfortunately, some texts are not coming out as we want to. But anyway, so we would now like to, at this point, present some of the findings and outputs and outcomes. So the findings that we'd like to share are almost all have been consolidated in the outputs and in the works that go into the exhibit that you will be seeing after the presentation. What I'd like to emphasize with the presentation now will focus on the maps. So now that we were able to produce are of different forms. So maps that would contest or respond to the Basis Conversion and Development Authority marketing collaterals. So BCDA, that's the government agency that is responsible, has the mandate to plan for the development of New Clark City. And of course, they have their own marketing videos, marketing paraphernalia, and we try to counteract and respond to the points that they've been raising. by gathering information and the experiences of people to also present their perspective about how they live and utilize the area and the resources within this their communities in New Clark City. And we also created maps or helped created or co-create maps that illustrate community members' lived spaces. This is through the creation of the mental maps that Dr. Lopez talked about earlier. We also have maps that expose issues and challenges. As Dr. Lopez mentioned earlier, there were focus group discussions, there were community mapping activities and mental mapping activities, all of which try to elicit the everyday experiences of people in relation to the challenges that they encounter, whether it's directly related to the development project or not. And also maps that are imbued, therefore, with local knowledge. So these would be some of the examples of these maps. I'd go through them, try to go through them one by one. The upper left map combines images that we have taken as we go to the field of the changes in the landscape that has taken place. This is, of course, in coordination with a community participant who would tell us stories about what happened in the area and provide us the historical context of these changes. And then we use satellite imagery that are open sources. Anyone can readily download, and we input our fieldwork results, such as the areas that we traversed, the new pathways that are not yet reflected in the maps to show that, in fact, the satellite images are not as updated. So there's really rapid changes going on week per week, day by day. Trucks don't stop. They just continue to work 24 hours a day. So you could imagine we come back 2 weeks, 3 weeks after, or even a week after, and so many changes have taken place already. And that cannot be captured by free satellite imagery. So that's also the reason why we conducted field reconnaissance, and also drone mapping played a very important role in documenting those very rapid changes. Right below or right beside it would be the mental map of a youth, member of the community, that shows her activity space on a day-to-day basis. But it's really interesting that at one point, or at one part of the map, she mentioned that we have a very beautiful life here in our community, but lands are being taken away from us, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So the feeling of insecurity, of unsureness, of uncertainty about the future coming from the youth is something that is very striking and should be striking. The map on right below that, the map drawn by a youth would show the hazard areas. The red ones would be the ones that are prone to flooding, because remember that it's supposedly a almost hazard-free area. That's why it's being developed. But then, as we can see, coming from also government generated maps, the hazard is there. It's for real. I mean, based on modeling, no, there is a potential for flood risks, or susceptibility of flooding runs through the river networks that go through the New Clark City. Right below the map on the left, we have the extent of a map showing the extent of New Clark City. We also have it in the exhibit, so you could take a closer look at it later on. And then this shows also the estimated number of population number of people living in the immediate surroundings and within the New Clark City area or site of development. And this map is so we combine satellite imagery, the narratives of people, by labeling the points of interest that the community members have identified through fieldwork. And we also tag these photos and these significant places with the narratives or the descriptions that were shared to us by the community members. So we could see with all these outputs that we're combining maps, references, data from different sources in order to make sense of all these pieces of information that could potentially be beneficial, not just for the people within the project area, but also for the knowledge and awareness of the people outside. I've mentioned that one important output would be the aerial shots and the aerial photos, because the change is very rapid. So we have these two examples of these images. We're actually working on another phase of analyzing available satellite imagery to be able to compare how much has changed. And we're doing this GIS-based analysis as the second phase after our initial findings. And part of the outputs, of course, would be the memes and the campaign videos, because as we have mentioned, it's important to engage the public in this issue. And one of the ways by which we do that, to start the discussion also and to spark up the conversation, would be very short, 5 or 10-second campaign videos and the memes. And you know that generation now can easily relate to memes and campaign videos. Along the process of engaging with counter mapping, we've encountered people who are also of the same perspective about helping communities deal with the challenges of development aggression. And they've done, and we're quite surprised. Personally, me, I'm quite surprised with the amount of work that they've already done in relation to creating literary works. And we're very fortunate that for this exhibit, we are able to collate and compile them into that one literary collection. Most of these works will be coming from Kamandag. It's a collective. It's an artist collective. But different from some artist collectives, the orientation of Kamandag is really for helping out communities against development aggression. That's also part of their work. And then the photo book, where we compiled the images that have been shared by community participants to auto photography, and then combining it also with the images that we have taken and we're doing field work. And so the sort of organized it thematically into different parts, into different themes, and it really was able to make a very creative and informative output as well. Right, so Dr. Yanni Lopez has already mentioned about these different steps that we have conducted in relation to the study. And so now we're working on writing and hopefully turning it into a manual as a guide to counter mapping, especially in the context of Philippine communities, similar to the study area that we've been talking about in Tarlac. These are some of the steps that we have undertaken during that process, and we will be, right after this engagement, we will be working back in our offices to be able to design and organize the content of these guide to counter mapping or the counter mapping protocols. Many of these have been discussed by Professor Lopez earlier. So I'm just gonna go through some other things or points of reflections, some pertaining to the factors that we believe are important in achieving the desired outputs and the desired outcomes of the project. One of it, which of course is time, and time is crucial. And with the way that development aggression is progressing in that particular area in the Philippines, the time is urgent. So that's also the reason why we together with the support groups are trying to maximize our resources and our time as well in order to put up exhibits, talk to people, you know, and be able to share what we have consolidated as materials that could be used for disseminating information about New Park City. It's also important for the community to be committed, of course. In the area that we have visited, most of these are not organized communities, which means they would have local organizations, but at this point it's not that strong or not as strong as before, like 2 or 3 years ago when the development of the area began, and there were also support groups. There were also a lot of support groups that provided assistance. Unfortunately, that momentum sort of waned, and so now we're trying to revive the hope and the efforts among people to reorganize themselves through the help, hopefully, of some of the outputs that we have created. It's also important for local coordinators and leaders to be able to facilitate and to act as to mediate the research process, because in our experience, we, as mentioned by Dr. Lopez earlier, we have a community coordinator who spent years in community organizing, and her work in our project is very crucial because she knows the people that we need to, or that should be involved in the research, and she knows how, the flows and what's the ins and outs in the community. It's also important to be able to identify what are the enabling or disabling factors in the environment. For example, support groups are very enabling. Support groups would be comprised of, for example, non-government organizations or artist collectives or government offices such as the Human Rights Office, where our community coordinator is working, would provide assistance to newcomers like us who were not really that familiar in the area. But it could also be disabling elements in the environment or in the area. That could be, for example, if there are personalities that are facilitating the progression of the changes that are taking place. Many of which are undesirable changes, of course, for the community. And it's important to identify also how to navigate that situation as a researcher. That is also related to tapping support networks. So it's also very important to identify who your comrades are and where they are and the work that they do and how your research could also contribute to their work. And lastly is the identification within the research team of the roles and tasks, and also being able to engage the community participants by teaching them also how the methods work. Like, for example, at some point, the youth were also taught how to use GPS to mark the places that are significant to them. The autophotography also allowed people to use their cameras to record and in the process to articulate what are the things in the environment or around in the surroundings that are important to them. All right, so a few reflection points that we've also like to raise and we've also learned through the process of engaging in counter mapping are the following. So it's important, we've been saying that it should be a co-production or co-creation of knowledge, but really getting to the co-production, what does that entail? What does that process entail? Are there success indicators to that? These are things that we also need to think about. What about also engaging other stakeholders that are not perhaps not that supportive of the campaign against development aggression? The question of how we could also dialogue with them or facilitate a dialogue with them is also crucial. What kinds of transformations are taking place? But this would be in the lives of those who are involved in the research participants, the researchers, our volunteers, for example, have written some reflections also on the learnings that they have gained through the process of contributing their time to this research, and most of these are already written right behind the screen, which you could read later on. In what ways do research with the objective of helping the oppressed really engaging in this process of transformation? And in what ways do we construct data, and how do we use them to cultivate activism? So these are also some things that we should be asking ourselves. In addition to that would be what new relationships are being forged and what old ties are being strengthened towards solidarity among members of the community and the partners that support them. So it's also important to realize that counter mapping is also about creating new relationships and perhaps strengthening old relationships towards that sense again of being a community and being and establishing solidarity in order to address the big issues and the big concerns. Some of the reflection points as I continue would be how can motivation of community members to organize their efforts and continue their commitment to resist development aggression be sustained amidst the pressure coming at different fronts, because this is a very large, important, crucial for the government, right? That's the level of importance or significance of this project to our national government. And so it's very important to be able to gather the strength and the motivation to continue and to commit to resisting development aggression. We need to assess individual and organizational capacity. So this also is some realization that we have experienced during the project. Considering also that we are coming from diverse backgrounds. One of us is a genetic engineer. I'm working on maps and GIS. So Yanni is also doing child education or geographic education. So, and Andrea is doing many sorts of research. So coming from different, I think it's very important. We believe that it's important to look at how we could synergize our approaches. And it's not like one approach all of the time. We're not always in agreement with each other. So there should be ways by which we could creatively and resourcefully put together our expertise and our specializations in order to achieve the outcomes that we want. How do we deal with tension between diverse practices and approaches as well? Yanni has mentioned this. It's sometimes, academic rigor versus what is possible. What is basically possible to do for the community, for a community that is not as organized. By organized, I mean, communities that are organized, that have local organizations, they would have regular meetings, they're always in constant communication. And so, if you lose that kind of stimulus, so it's also important to be able to deal with what's possible versus what you have planned to be the outcome of your research. So some of the challenges and trajectories that would be, important for all of us to think about would be, one is how to facilitate a dialogue among key stakeholders, because we cannot shield ourselves, from the powers or the structures in the society that perpetuate development aggression, for example. But how do we engage? Yes, if you consider them as stakeholders as well. How can we improve and develop counter mapping as a methodology in addressing social justice issues, not just in the Philippines, but in other parts of the world? So we're also here to hear from you. And for those out there who are tuned in, we're hoping that you would, give us ideas, respond to our questions, help us reflect on the things that we have experienced, because we also want to learn from how counter mapping is being done in other parts of the world. One challenge also is how we negotiate power relations among state actors, activists, academics, and various institutions. We are saying that we are inclusive, but what is the boundary, or is there a limit to that inclusiveness? And what limits that is important to acknowledge. How do we develop outputs that are relevant to the concerns of marginalized communities? Because if we are working with them, then the output should also be useful for them. It should be in ways that they understand. It should be in ways that they can say to other people, this is what we found out, and you can see it here, and you can easily share it with other people. With the last slides, we'd like to show that we're in the process of making a website. It's still being designed. The components or the parts of it is still being designed, but we're hoping that the university could, University of the Philippines could be able to host this through its website. And as we can see here, we've initially conceptualized the different parts or components of this counter mapping Philippines website. So this is not, we are the ones who are initiating this, but we are not owning this because we want as many as counter mapping practitioners in the country to be able to contribute to this. So that the stories here, as you can see in one of the tabs, and the projects that will be presented here are not just these projects specifically, but all of the projects and all of the people who would like to be involved. And so just to show some parts of that counter mapping Philippines website, we'd be featuring with different projects and different stories that the different projects could come up with, as well as the maps that would be created out of these different counter mapping practices in the country. So we also hope that at some point when this is ready, you'd be able to view it and perhaps also contribute to it. All right, so with that, I guess we're finished with our presentation. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, then I think we're open to.
So right now we are going to hear from our two collaborators from the University of Glasgow, Mia Perry and Brian Barrett.
Thank you. So I think firstly we should probably, before we have very little to add, we should probably thank these three presenters for this presentation and the project so far. So yes, I'm Mia Perry, this is Brian Barrett, and we were brought on initially as co-organised technically, but really a University of Glasgow based support system for Andre. So I think the first thing I wanted to say is congratulations and well done, because as many of us know, Andre, who was relatively new to the university at the time, had to navigate all sorts of systems in order to pull off just the very basic functionality of this project. And I think I'm speaking for both of us, we're super impressed with how productive and rich the project has emerged to be over a relatively short period of time. So firstly, that's what I was going to say, thank you. We're going to give just a couple of reflections because we've had a bit of a head start, not much, but a bit of a head start than you guys, and then just facilitate some questions and answers for 15 to 20 minutes. Shall I go? I've written notes and you don't.
Well, I do.
Oh, you do? Okay, so I thought I'd just say three things. Firstly, that I think the project has been beautifully framed today, specifically around this idea of the non-neutrality of maps. And Andre asked at the very beginning, where do maps come from? And I think that thread runs throughout as really important and pivotal to this project. Where do maps come from? Not only the marketing, the possibly aggressive maps or the marketing maps of the state, but also our own maps. So there's an element of reflexivity that I think it has begun to happen already in this presentation, is possibly an area of future direction. Maps is not benign, no matter whether there are maps, are well-intentioned maps, or a state map of marketing. The second thing I wanted to say that has been really important, that came out in Yanni's section of the presentation, is how carefully and thoughtfully the methodology has been developed or has emerged. And I think that careful attention to the sorts of principles of research work that is participatory and community-based is something that we often speak about. And I think rarely do we see it, even if we think about the percentage of time it took in this hour that we listened to our colleagues. I think rarely do we give it the attention in the field and in the outcomes that we've seen in this project. And I think that's really commendable. And I'm just going to bring out one aspect, although there is much that can be spoken about, and that's in relation to time. We are, I think at the University of Glasgow, we're quite used to complaining about not having enough time. So we're in a funding cycle where we have 3 weeks to write an application, we have 3 months to spend the money, and we're constantly asking our funders for more time because these things take time, relationships take time, and we know that. We know there's a huge fault and superficiality about the way we carry out research because of a lack of time. And I think what this project highlights is that's actually not really good enough. It's not good enough for us to say we don't have time, because a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, especially in places like the Philippines in the global south, are urgent. And so if we only have 3 months, we have 3 months, and there's a lot that needs to be accomplished. So I think that tension between the time it takes to do good research, the time it takes to build real relationships, in relationship with the urgency of the issues that we're dealing with, is something that we really need to take on quite seriously. And sometimes we only have a week, and so let's use a week. We have a different scale of time here at the university. Many of us are on permanent contracts. I've got 5 years before I get put under extreme pressure to do something different. But those scales, I think, need to be addressed in a very different way when we're doing this research. So that was just the one methodological thing I wanted to bring up. And my last point, and this is something that I've raised in our conversations over this project, is a bit of a challenge to this idea of resistance and counter. I work in the context of community education and community development here in the university, and a lot of what we do is resistant to something and is counter to something. And a lot of the methodological frameworks that we use are critical of something. And so I've asked our colleagues, and I put it out here today, the question of what extent are we obliged to also build platforms of engagement with those people who we consider the aggressors, with those people who we consider the sanctioned, the state, the authority, the powerful. To what extent are we obliged to build platforms or bridges with those audiences, to the same extent that we are obliged to have a commitment to and to support our communities? And what do we do by being distracted from that? What do we do by focusing on communities, by focusing on our allies, and on the subjugated? What do we do to the bigger picture of the plight of our activist progressive research, I suppose? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I suppose I'll just describe the context that I'm coming from, which is quite different. I suppose my background is in geomatics and engineering surveying. Most of my research is also, well, in mapping and modeling, but also always trying to get the most accurate geometric representation of a landscape or an area that we're interested in looking at. So before meeting with Andre in last July, August, I've never come across this concept of counter mapping. It's not something I do in my research. Most of our students are based in the School of Geographical and Earth Sciences, where we have an MSc program in Geoinformation Technology and Cartography, where we teach students how to use different instruments like total station laser scanners, using UAV data and remote sensing data, but always trying to, for example, for generation of accurate, geometrically correct topographic maps and so on like that. So using some maybe similar approaches in terms of using different spatial analysis, remote sensing techniques, but for a different kind of purpose in terms of as a approach to cultivate activism, was a very different perspective on using very similar data types that I would use as well. And for me, I suppose making the link between the outputs of creating the community maps, how we link that with the maps of authority or that are actually existing already. And also, how do we not put the communities that we work with in a position where they are vulnerable in terms of, for example, cultivating activism in these areas, and then we leave the communities. Are they left vulnerable then in terms for these larger state actors to have more power? And a lot of these reflections were mentioned, I suppose, in terms of managing those power relations then, and then what are the next steps for the communities. And I think for me, yeah, that was like you had all the reflections, I suppose, there that we were discussing yesterday, pretty much clear. So.
Okay. Why don't you come back, please? Yeah, why don't you come up to the front and do questions?
We'll just end the Zoom.
Yes.
Okay.
So can we leave Zoom going? Yeah. So why don't you three just stand at the front and you can take one lecture.
Okay. All right, so we have 3 questions from via Zoom.
Okay, so I'll read the link to the mic. How has the group looked into using climate data to do counter mapping? A question from Singapore.
Yep. We've not really incorporated climate data yet in our research. I think that would go into layers of vulnerability of the community. Yes. I'm sorry. So I guess the physical data relating to climate would be important in relation to another layer, which is vulnerability of the community, which would be flood risks, for example, and also it's just one map that I showed you, but we also have another map of landslide susceptibility, and the area is also susceptible to that. So it would also be good to, if we want to continue exploring vulnerability aspects of the community, because that's also an important aspect that we could explore, because that also sort of adds up to that situation that they're, or the context.
Okay. Should we alternate? Is there a question from the room?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm a geologist by training, so I'm an engineer here. I look at geological maps of the Philippines, maybe, and I look for things like deltas, I look for rivers, look for high ground, volcanic structures, tectonics. When I come across things like counter, I start thinking social history, military history, war history. Maps are used for war. So the history of the Philippines, they want to like Cuba, they have a social resistance there that's going on with the government. I don't know much about the history of the Philippines. So to use these words of activism and counter, it sounds a bit like Cuba.
Well,
And this is Mayday today.
well, yeah, May 1. Araw na manggagawa.
Yeah.
Well, the Philippines was colonized by Spain for almost 300 years, by the United States for around 50 years, which was intense and intrusive. That's why we can, I guess, speak English in a way. And then a bit briefly by the Japanese. So it's tied to this long colonial struggles around a lot of issues involving land. I think land is one of the key themes that resonate in various parts of the Philippines. And actually right now, in both rural areas and urban areas, like land that's associated with colonial legacies of who owns lands and property ownerships, political economic elites. It's similar to Cuba in one way or another, but not yet like Cuba, I guess, in terms of, they don't have a Fidel Castro.
We did have an Imelda Marcos.
Oh, with different kind of personality. Yeah. But we share a lot of commonalities with a lot of Latin American countries in terms of our colonial experience and our links with the United States. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take a Zoom question. What are the different institutions or professions involved to run the project and the activities? What were the competencies needed? What were the competencies that were needed?
Well, in the context of the project, as I have mentioned earlier, our collaborators are, among us, the core team, as we would call it, we're geographers, anthropologists, genetic engineers, people who are working both in the quantitative and qualitative aspects of research. And then outside of that immediate circle or the core team, we have volunteers. These are students who would surprisingly are also very skilled in terms of making maps, cartography. They do have those kinds of skills and research skills because they know how to interpret the interviews even if they weren't there. or they weren't present during the conduct of the activity. And then outside of that, another layer would be the artists that we are currently working with, and community organizers, network of community organizing, I guess. So in terms of what skill sets are necessary to be able to pull off a project like this, skills are also important, but I guess the courage is also an important part of this work, because there are a lot of uncertainties when you go to the places that we visit, and bringing along students with us would also be, we think about it a lot, so many times. So because mapping is also an important part of it, and as we have seen, we're using different sources, satellite imagery. So in many ways, it's also technical, but you also have that. You also have to have that social science skills of being able to establish relationships with people with a very short, limited time that we have. So it's about capturing cues from people, understanding what they mean, knowing something about the context, and being open. Openness is also a very important aspect, aside from the skill sets. I don't know if my colleagues would want to add more.
I just wanted to say that well, this project has been a learning experience for all of us. So Oni mentioned earlier that we're sort of human. I'm a human geographer. All of us are human geographers, but we have different specializations. So this enabled us to collaborate finally in a way that has a funding, and they make it more systematic. So it really facilitates. It's like a seed that made it grow, and we're excited about the future possibilities that with this seed grant can offer in terms of cultivating these. I mean, in the past there were like so much smaller projects that are unfunded that we would do because of a class, or in my case, I was part of a different institute back then. I was doing it under the radar. Wasn't accounted for as a faculty member back then. So this gave it a structure in one way or another, and I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone has learned a lot from each other in terms of various skill sets.
Sorry, I'd also like to add that we have a collaborator who is a critical visual artist, Sian Dairit. He's engaged in a lot of counter mapping activities in different communities in the Philippines, with a similar methodology of making people draw their cognitive maps. And then because he's a very important person when it comes to visual arts, he was able to put up this exhibit at the Cultural Center of the Philippines as an awardee of CCP. So having that connection also to for me, it's a different field. It's not really different, it's related. But opening up that kind of network is also very important to this kind of work.
Great. Keith,
Hi, Keith Gray from
Okay.
Studies at SHLC here. Thanks very much for that. Very interesting stuff. And I echo the chair. Are you chair? But I echo your comments.
We're the helpers.
How much have you achieved
We're the help.
in such a short time, which is really, really impressive. I've not got quite a lot of questions, but I won't ask all of them just now. But I mean, one thing I wanted to know really about this particular Clark, what's it called, New Clark City. I mean, obviously the underlying story here, in the words that you've used, is about development aggression and about oppressed marginalised people. But in order to understand the value of this, could you say a bit more about what sort of land tenure arrangements prevail in this area, and what the process of expropriation is, and any compensatory arrangements that there might be, and therefore what are the risks that these communities are facing? Because obviously that's what you're trying to mitigate in some sense, or to resist in some sense. But so what is the nature of the problem? Really, is my question here. I mean, that probably that probably opens Philippines are a big field, but in summary, it would be really helpful, I think, to know that.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, then there's the question about then what can be done about it through this process, which is a different question, which I'm not actually asking at this point.
Okay, so forgive me, but I have to summarize that for the Zoom participants. So the question is relating to what is the nature, the specific nature of the problem in terms of the existing land tenure arrangements and the appropriation potential, the compensation, and so what risks are faced, therefore, by the community?
This New Clark City project is actually on military land, which was a military base. It used to be an American military base. So they are used right now. The Philippine government in this drive towards building new cities, they're using a lot of former military lands and converting them to new urban development projects. So a lot of the people, well, the people there don't necessarily have titles on land. So that is used as a way of saying that you don't really have rights there. And while on paper they are supposed to receive certain compensation, in practice, based on our field accounts, it's variable. There are farmers, for example, who are given like 7 days notice. You have to leave and vacate, and we will give you, I'm thinking of the conversion, but like 30,000 pesos for this plot of land, which is definitely not enough. Or no, 30,000 pesos. I mean, forgot the exact term, but it's definitely not enough. But you only have 7 days. But then there are farmers where they just see the bulldozer coming in. In practice, because of the urgency of the project, they have not fully the compensation package is not fully put up, which is for me, it's a nature of the Philippine state in terms of offering for its citizens. It's always it's not as efficient.
So I know you have to wrap up. One more question, just because. Yeah. Okay. So last question.
Hi, my name is Mahesh. I am a political economist. So my question is, I guess it's methodology related. What I wanted to ask was the terms you use, like counter mapping and activist research. When you explain the process, it looks very familiar to something like action research or participatory GIS. Are they fundamentally different, or is that not the terminology different?
Okay, so the question is, what's the relationship with this particular methodology and other pre-existing, possibly similar methodologies, for example, participatory GIS? So mostly the differences.
It's a question that's quite difficult to answer, especially if we want to distinguish it against participatory GIS or for example. But I guess with counter mapping, with participatory GIS or participatory mapping, it's not really, it's broad, yes, that's one. Second is it's not explicitly directed towards
Social justice issues,
yes.
Highlighting concerns of marginalized
communities. So I guess that's what somehow distinguishes counter mapping, because it's the explicit goal of it is to be able to help these marginalized communities express.
And you're countering a dominant map or a map that's being produced by certain institutions. So it's you're countering map by another map. It's like a battle of maps in one way or another, because maps can silence certain narratives. So in a way, it's also a process of reclaiming mapping, and who is what is it for? Because mapping per se has been associated with colonialism. It's very political mapping. Yes. Okay, there you go. Okay, so I'll just end. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. No, not yet. We'll just end the Zoom. Yeah. So I just want to say bid goodbye to the Zoom. Sorry. So thank you all to those who have joined us online via Zoom. So a video recording and copy of the slides will be sent to all participants in the next few days. We will now stop the live streaming of the presentation and begin our more question and answer discussions, and then we will also begin our audiovisual exhibition, which will be explained by Oni later, especially for those who are here, who have joined us here in Glasgow. So thank you again to our online participants for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you to another SHLC seminar soon.
Okay.